Let's talk reformers. We have been moving through their lives, and we have arrived at my favorite of the reformers. Although I say that every week. John Knox next week really is my deep favorite. But John Calvin, I think, provided more for the Reformation and for the church moving forward than any of the others. So we're going to look at this man. His name is John Calvin, one of the most significant individuals that Christianity has ever produced. And so we're going to kind of look at his life. One of the things about his life, and I did the same thing with Luther, and I'll do the same thing with Calvin tonight, he was not perfect. And we learn this through, I think we have a tendency with our heroes to kind of sugarcoat everything about them and make them perfect. And the truth is that none of these men were. They were used by God in incredible ways, but none of them were perfect. And we're going to see that pretty clearly in his life. John Calvin was born July 10th, 1509. Okay, so we're talking a little over 500 years at this point. He was born in this little town called Noyon, France, in the north of France. He was raised in a staunch Roman Catholic family. I mean, all of these reformers, that was the only way you were raised at that point because there were really no other options. But staunch Roman Catholic family. His mother died when he was very young, but his father, Gerard, found great prosperity as the administrator of the local town cathedral. So he was kind of one of the officials at the church. He was the one who rang the church's bells. He was the one who took the money and put it together in order to send it to Rome. He was the one kind of who kept the records of all baptisms and all confirmations and all the different marriages. And he was the town administrator for the Catholic Church. So Calvin grew up among, he and his family were not aristocratic or influential, but he grew up among that group, that people who were very wealthy and very influential. His son, Gerard, Calvin's father, had priestly ambitions for all his sons. So he wanted them to enter the priesthood. He wanted them to serve the Lord in that way. Just for context, because I know this is kind of hard when we're covering such a huge period of time in this series. Calvin was 8 years old when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door at the church at Wittenberg. So Luther was an adult by then, but Calvin was only 8 years old, so he was significantly younger. At the age of 14, Calvin went to Paris to study at the Collège de la Marche, at part of the University of Paris. It's a really beautiful place. You're going to see some pictures in today's notes and going through. He lived in some of the most beautiful places and studied in some of the most beautiful places on earth, but he went at age 14. I mean, that's very significant. We're going to see that play out in his life. And one of the things that's consistent across all of these reformers is that all of them received good education. That was the key that God had provided at this point to unlocking more potential for them. But this is what he studied, and he was very clear about this. He studied grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Those were the subjects that he studied at the University of Paris. What is missing from that list?
Religion.
Theology or religion. That's what was missing, and it's intentional because at this point his father realized that the priesthood was not going to offer him his sons the income that they needed, and so he was pushing them to enter into other areas. And so he never studied theology until later in his life, which is ironic because he became, in part, one of the great theologians that has ever lived. About a year later, he was accepted into the prestigious Collège de Montaigu, the School of Philosophy at the University of Paris. Another year later, and his father sent him to the University of Orleans to study law, and that's where he had decided, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to study law. While in college, he was exposed to the writings and the teachings of the reformers like Martin Luther and others. But unlike the other reformers, he remained staunchly Catholic and stubbornly devoted to his faith. So whereas we read about some of the others like Jan Hus, during his college years was exposed to the writings of John Wycliffe, and that kind of compelled him to work toward Reformation. In this case, it did not. Calvin was stubbornly devoted to his Catholic faith. He continued to pursue his education for years, and he was very, very intelligent. He was sophisticated. He was a focused young man. He was a very, very, he was a force. He was accepted to study under all of these famous teachers and among different scholars around France, and they knew he was going to become a force. They didn't know for what, but they knew he was going to do something. He was fluent in French, English, German, Latin, and Greek. I mean, very, very learned young man. Earned his doctorate in 1532, and that same year published his first book, a commentary on Greek philosopher Seneca's philosophy. So, I mean, you're talking a very young man just out of his teenage years already publishing stuff about Greek philosophy. It seemed, and as I was reading all this, it seemed like his life was kind of set in one direction. Right? His life, he was raised in the right kind of family. He studied in the right kind of universities. He was trained in the right way. He was raised in the right kind of religion. He associated with the right kind of people. You could kind of see his life moving in a direction, but little did he know, in 1 year, his life was about to take a drastic turn. In 1533, John Calvin came to saving faith in Jesus Christ. That's the greatest sentence I think I'm going to say tonight in this. He writes almost nothing about it, which is very ironic, because he writes, we're going to see some of his writings. I have some of them I'm going to bring to show you guys, but he writes almost nothing about his conversion. He calls it, and there's just one small paragraph in his introduction to the commentary on the Psalms, but he called it a sudden and unexpected conversion, and he wrote, "God subdued my heart, which had become hardened against the truth of the gospel." God subdued my heart. Those two words, God subdued, in Latin we see them Deus subigit, which would become the hallmark of his teaching in his life, that God subdued him, that he did not pursue God, but God pursued his heart. Now today what I'm going to do, we're not going to go through his theology, we're going to go through his biography. Okay, we could spend the rest of the year, the rest of our lives probably studying the differences in his theology, but I just want to look at his biography today. His break from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, you got to see, staunch Roman Catholic family, raised up in the tradition of the church, studied in church-sponsored schools. The University of Paris was sponsored by the church, by the Catholic Church, and so now, all of a sudden, he's at odds with the church, but he did not want to break from the church at the beginning. His break from the Roman Catholic Church happened without his control, outside of his choice. He was good friends with a reformer named Nicholas Kopp. And this man, we don't know much about him, but he was good friends with this guy. And unexpectedly, in an address to a bunch of scholars and different people at the Royal College, Kopp denounced publicly the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, now we say that, and that's an easy sentence to say, but in 1533, that would have been a very, very dangerous thing to do. To stand up publicly and say, I denounce the Pope, I denounce what the church is doing. This would have been very, very dangerous. And so a riot broke out. It seems like it always happens. Every time that we turn a corner in these reformers, riots are always breaking out. But a riot broke out, and Nicholas Kopp was forced to flee the country, and he went to Switzerland. Calvin didn't have anything to do with this, but he was guilty by association. He knew Kopp, and he was friends with this man, and so he was implicated in charges of heresy. The first time in his life. He hadn't even publicly declared what he believed yet, or that he had, in his heart, made a break with the church, and so he was forced to flee as well. He moved around France for the next year. He tried. He went home for a little while, and he went to some different places, but he never could really find refuge. The authorities kept catching up to him. And then, at this time, tensions between Protestants and Catholics were erupting into full-scale violence. This was especially in Germany and in France, two places where it became very, very dangerous. And Germany ended up flipping. We're going to see this later on in the story. Germany became Protestant, and France largely remained Catholic. And so it became very dangerous to be a Protestant there. Calvin finally fled to Switzerland in 1534, and this is where he lived in the town of Basel. Isn't that a beautiful place? It gets better. He lives in better places than this. I don't understand. It's amazing. Okay, so it was there in Basel that he began to write, and this would be his greatest contribution to Christianity. He wrote this first edition of his masterpiece, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. I have my copies here. These are old copies, 1970, Institute of the Christian Religion. He wrote this originally as one volume. in his first edition, and it grew and grew and grew and grew from there. Mine's in 2 volumes, but there's 80 books included in these 2 volumes. Basically what this is an apologia. It's a defense of the Christian faith, and it's also kind of a defense of his personal beliefs on what he kind of had concluded. So it's a hard read. It's essential for students of doctrine. I read this in college, and I've read it several times since then. I probably haven't read it in the last 3 or 4 years. But you really have to sit down and say, today I'm going to read a chapter, and I'm going to just be content with that one chapter. But he wrote that, and he's going to continue to write on it for the rest of his life. So the church, he briefly returned to France, just for a little bit to see how things were going to go. But the church in France announced the Edict of Coucy, which basically gave Protestants 6 months. It was a 6-month notice. You either convert back to Catholicism and denounce your Protestant faith, or you face imprisonment on charges of heresy. And we've talked through this before. What did a charge of heresy typically come with? That was a poor way to phrase that, but typically it meant a death sentence. Yeah. Most of these reformers at some point were imprisoned or killed. So Calvin left France for the last time. He would never return, and he did that in about 1535 is when he left for the last time. He arrived, and he didn't choose to go back to Basel, but he went back to apparently the next most beautiful place on earth, which is the city of Geneva. Geneva, Switzerland, and he arrived in 1536. He pastored a Reformed church there, where Luther, when he started his Reformation, his churches were patterned after him, were called Lutheran churches, where Calvin's churches patterned after him, they were called Reformed churches. And so he pastored a Reformed church there. He was the first reformer to preach and to perform baptisms and to perform marriages and to perform burial ceremonies, last rites and different things without ever having been consecrated by the Roman Catholic Church. This is very, very significant. He was the first reformer to kind of do pastoral responsibilities without first becoming a priest in the church. And so very, very unique. So he was there for a little bit, and about a year later there was tension between his church and the city council, and that's going to be something that's going to spread through the rest of his life. This kind of tension between civic leaders and religious leaders is going to become a lot significant in his life. So at that point, he and his fellow reformer William Farel fled the city again. You see why this is so difficult to study the story of Calvin, because he moves about every year. He was in some new place, and he was moving around. So from here, he went to the next most beautiful city on earth. And this one, I think if I moved to this city, I don't think I would ever leave this city. I don't see what could ever compel me to leave this city. He went to the city of Strasbourg, which had been constantly in conflict. It's right on the border between France and Germany. But at this time, it was not part of either country. It was a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was not part of France or Germany. Now, today, it is part of France. So if you go there, you will be in France. But this is the best picture that I could find of the most lovely place on earth. It's just so picturesque. It's just absolutely beautiful, Strasbourg. And so he moved there, and he pastored a church of French refugees. Again, pretty significant. People were leaving France because of the persecution of Protestants at that point, and so he pastored them, and it was a church. The city was a refuge for reformers, because it wasn't part of. It was a free imperial city. It wasn't part of any governmental system or any nation. It was able to kind of be a sanctuary for them. He ministered there with another very important reformer named Martin Bucer. And Bucer had also worked with Luther in Germany, and so it's really neat. You're going to see him, Calvin, connect both to Luther, and he did know Martin Luther. They met several times. They had spoken, they corresponded, they knew each other, and he also was good friends with John Knox, who was the reformer we're going to see next week. But he was there. He was a strong force. Where Luther really advocated for reform in Germany, Calvin was advocating for reform worldwide. He was creating systems, and he was a mobilizing trailblazer for the Protestant Reformation everywhere in Europe. And so his writings were being disseminated. These may not be dinner conversation books for us today, but they were in 1540. I mean, these were spread everywhere, and so his thoughts and his teachings were going along with it. He wrote a few of, right there when he was in Strasbourg, he also wrote the first few of his commentaries. Again, very, very significant contributions to Christianity. I brought one of my commentaries. I've got 22 volumes of his commentaries. This one is on a harmony of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Again, very difficult to read. Originally written in Latin, translated into French, and then eventually translated into English. So you can see how difficult it can be to read. But I use these almost every week in looking at as I prepare to preach and teach. So he wrote the first few of those while he was in Strasbourg there. It was also here where Calvin got married. He had said that he never would. He said, my heart is for the Lord, and I can't share with anybody else. But then as soon as he moved to Strasbourg, he started to ask some of his reformer friends to set him up, basically. Find me somebody. And so he wrote this. He said, I'm still not married at that point. I'm still not married, and I do not know whether I ever will be. If I take a wife, it will be because, being better freed from numerous worries, I can devote myself to the Lord. All right, those are the words of a bachelor, I think. Things changed. That line of thinking didn't last for very long. He soon began to ask his friends, and this is specifically what he asked. And this is not really much to do with his biography. I want you to see his heart. He asked his friends to help him find a woman who was chaste, obliging, not fastidious, economical, patient, and careful for his health. So,
is that all?
Is that it? That's it? That's all. Not much. I mean, come on. Just point at a random person, you probably find that. He was engaged briefly to a young woman, and he got cold feet and broke off the wedding. He was very, very nervous about the whole thing. But then his good friend Martin Bucer introduced him to a woman named Idalette de Bure, and he fell in love with her, and they were married in August of 1540. She was a widow and already had 2 kids. So a little scandalous for the time. Although I think a lot more scandalous had he married the first woman that he was engaged to, because she was like 23 years his junior, and that would have been a little weird. But, so here's a picture of her. Here's a picture of her, Idalette. So they were married in August of 1540. She had the 2 children, like I said, and she and Calvin had several children, none of whom survived. So none of them survived even infancy. So they didn't really have, they didn't raise any children. But just like Luther, we saw last week, they took in kids from refugee families. They took in kids who had been displaced. There was always children in their home, and that was a big part of their life. In 1541, remember, he's living here. I just want to remind you where he's living. But in 1541, the City Council of Geneva wanted him back. They had kicked him out, so they had forced him to leave, but now they wanted him back. And when he first found out, this is what he said. When he first got the letter they wanted him back, this is what he wrote. I would rather submit to death 100 times than return to Geneva. But he eventually reluctantly agreed and went back. I just love it. You could just tell how human this guy is. I mean, he's like, I'm never going back. Have you ever said that? I am never doing that. I am never going there. I'm never going to do, and then you turn around a year later and there you are. So he reluctantly agreed, and he returned to the city of Geneva. He was there at the same church, at the Reformed church in the city of Geneva, and here's a picture of his wife and then a picture of his church where he was. That's largely original. A lot of these churches at some point in history burned at different points or were destroyed, but that is mostly the original church, especially the tallest part that you can see there. And then this is actually his original pulpit that he would preach from. I don't know, hopefully, I know I put it kind of low for you to see, but imagine preaching from a pulpit that you had to walk up a winding staircase to get through. But he preached 2,000 sermons here at the church in Geneva. That is basically 2 to 3 sermons a week for 23 years and no breaks. I mean, he preached his whole life. Historians record that he regularly preached for over an hour with no notes. He was a very, very, very intelligent person. I remember in Bible college, we were talking about Charles Spurgeon, because Spurgeon preached 9 to 10 times a week. And in the midst of that, he often preached without notes. And so we were learning, though, how we need notes. All right, we have to have something. And so one of the kids raised his hand and said, Spurgeon didn't use notes? Why do we need to use notes? And the professor looked at him and said, because you, sir, are no Spurgeon. And it was a good moment. But he preached, the hallmark of his preaching, and this was very unique, and this is what's going to impact churches moving forward, and impacts my ministry today. He preached expositionally and sequentially through books of the Bible. He would preach through, he'd choose a book of the Bible, and he would preach through it. It's recorded from March 1555 to July 1556 that he delivered 200 sermons on the Book of Deuteronomy. 200 sermons on the Book of Deuteronomy. It was this preaching ministry of his church where he crafted, enlarged his series of commentaries that we have. Although, ironically, we talked about this when we first started through Revelation. He did not write a commentary on the Book of Revelation. So that was an interesting tidbit about him. But he preached regularly at that church. In 1545, Calvin's wife Idolette contracted the Black Plague. And she would never recover. She lived for several years after that, but she would never recover. She was bedridden for 4 years. And so in 1549, she finally passed away. And Calvin wrote this, I have been bereaved of the best friend of my life. He would never remarry. His heart was for her. But that was, this, I guess you could say this is kind of the beginning of the end for him. Things aren't going to go great in his life from this moment on. He faced bitter opposition to his leadership throughout his life. And what leader hasn't? I mean, just being honest, but especially during his years in Geneva, groups like the Libertines, I have a picture of this group. I love, this is when they start to wear the real puffy kind of things and the tights, and it's great. But there's a group called the Libertines and the city magistrates. They relentlessly contended with him. I mean, it was a constant thing. He tried over and over and over to resign from the church. But each and every time the church said no, and the city council stood with him finally. But this was a constant problem. Actually, in 1547, there was a plot by one of these Libertines to kill John Calvin. But the would-be assassin was discovered beforehand. Evidence was found at his home. He was tried, convicted, and beheaded. So it was a very serious thing in this time. A full-on coup or a riot, an insurrection occurred in 1554 when these Libertines challenged Calvin's authority, but the insurrection was put down and the leaders were all executed. So this is where we're going to start to get into some stuff about Calvin. Because one of the things that he has been accused of in his, now looking back at history, is that he created a theocracy in the city of Geneva. That means a rule by religious leaders. And so, in his own theology, if you read the Institutes, he's very clear on the separation of church and state. He does not believe that the church should be controlled by, or the state should be controlled by the church and vice versa. But it's obvious in his dealings with the city of Geneva that he did not practice what he was preaching. That he effectively, his church and the Reformed Church of Geneva controlled the city to some extent. But one of the dark stains on the life and history of John Calvin happened in 1553. There was a man named Michael Servetus. I got a picture of him right here, distinguished-looking gentleman. He was a heretic. This time a real one. Yeah, I know everybody on earth has been called a heretic in this series on the Reformers, but this man really was a heretic. He had published some books on crazy doctrine. I mean, he had some really, really out there views on the Trinity and on original sin and on all these different things. And so he and Calvin engaged one another very forcefully. They had written a series of really ugly letters to one another. There's a great painting of him visiting him in prison. I love Servetus's face. It's just so grumpy. But they had a really bad relationship. They were writing one another heated letters back and forth. It kind of came to a head, though, when Servetus sent him a copy of his own books, heavily annotated, edited, crossed out, pages torn out, saying this is what it should, your work should be. That kind of pushed him over the edge. So this is where we're going to be honest about John Calvin. He is, again, one of my favorite men in history, but he contacted and he alerted the Spanish Inquisition about Servetus. Servetus was a Spanish national. And so he informed them, he sent copies of the letters that he had received, and he informed the Spanish Inquisition. Now, what does that typically mean if you know anything about history? Torture and death. I mean, that's what it means. So an arrest warrant was issued for him. He was taken into custody in Lyon, France. And it's such a strange thing. He went into France, he pretended to be a doctor. He pretended to be somebody totally different. He practiced medicine with no doctoral background at all. Pretty scary thing. Even as they tortured him, he still said, I'm not him, I'm not Michael Servetus, when they full well knew it was. So kind of an interesting thing. But he was taken in custody, he was in prison, and he escaped from prison and fled the country. And of all places on planet Earth, do you know where he came?
Geneva.
To Geneva, Switzerland. And I don't know.
I'm looking for somebody.
So that may be the context of what we're seeing here.
I got something for you.
But he passed through the city of Geneva, and John Calvin found out about it. Calvin alerted the local authorities, and Servetus was arrested. He was put on trial, and Calvin was one of the witnesses against him in this trial. And the trial lasted from the 21st of August to the 20th of October of 1553, and a few days later, Michael Servetus was burned at the stake, with Calvin's, not just permission, but his full endorsement. This is tough for us. 21st century sensibilities, very tough for us to understand. We would never assume, even if we disagreed with somebody on the deepest points of theology, that we would ever agree to anybody's death on account of it. So this was, first of all, we have to understand the 16th century was a different place. They would cut your head off for almost anything. And so the whole culture was a lot more raw, a lot more barbaric, but nonetheless, to me, this is a very dark stain on Calvin's life. And this kind of shows you that he had set up a system in Geneva where the church was ruling. And I think that's the height of kind of the darkest irony, because that's what he had escaped from. A religion that was controlling the state, and so I really can't understand that. Let's move on, though. Calvin, he had worked hard to cooperate with the other reformers. Like I said, he had a great relationship with Martin Luther. They disagreed on several things, though, so they never really worked together in that sense. Mainly, their disagreement was on the nature of the Eucharist, or on the nature of communion. Luther still held that communion, that the bread and the wine became the actual body and blood of Christ, and John Calvin disagreed. And so there's that, where they had those disagreements, but for the most part they worked together. He supported also Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was reforming England at the time. If you know history, we're going to talk about that a little bit next week with John Knox. But Thomas Cranmer had called for an ecumenical synod. That's like just a group of all Protestants. Why don't we all get together and have just a big meeting, and let's hash out some of this theology. It never happened, but it was a step in the right direction for Protestants at that time. He gave shelter to exiled reformer John Knox, and we're going to talk about that next week. He had fled Scotland, and together during this time with William Whittingham, John Knox, Miles Coverdale, and others, they produced a full English translation of the Bible. Not the first, but the first full English translation of the Bible, translated from the original Greek and Hebrew in 1569. It's called the Geneva Bible, and I have a very early copy of it, or one page of it. Not a whole copy, that'd be millions. I have a copy from First Chronicles, so this was the cheapest one that I could find. It's basically a list of names and stuff. This isn't original to the 1500s, but very early copy, and so this was a huge step forward in the right direction. William Tyndale had created the first English translation of the New Testament, translated from Greek and Hebrew, but this is the first time the entire Bible had been translated from the original languages. One of the first things, too, that you see in this is that there's commentary in the margins. First time that had ever happened. Typically, when they translated Scripture, they didn't want anything to cloud the words of God or to, kind of influence what you thought. But these are Calvin's notes here on his preaching, the 2,000 sermons that he had preached, and so there are commentaries in there. It's a very significant thing. If you want to take a look at that after, that would be great. But so they published that. It's called the Geneva Bible. One of the most significant contributions to Christianity. Here's John 3:16 in the Geneva Bible. Again, written 500 years ago. It's weird. The spelling is different, slightly different than some of the other ones that we've seen before. Very much the Bible, I'll say this as gently as I can, very much in the Reformed tradition. So if for those who don't hold to that Reformed tradition, it's probably not the Bible that they would have wanted. But this is very significant. This is the Bible that William Shakespeare would have read. This is the Bible that John Bunyan quotes in Pilgrim's Progress. This was carried to the New World by the Pilgrims in 1620, and this is what George Washington himself would have read. So as he was, in the American Revolution, this is what he would have read. I actually have this. I just got this not too long ago. A brand new version, modernized Geneva Bible. So I'm pretty proud of that. It came in a bunch of smaller ones. I haven't been able to get into it yet, but again, making contributions 500 years later is the Geneva Bible. Calvin worked tirelessly to reform the French church. He tried very, very hard to see his home country, his homeland, reformed. One historian wrote, he supplied the dogma, the liturgy, the moral ideas of the new religion, and he also created ecclesiastical, political, and social institutions in harmony with it. He was a born leader. He followed up his work with personal appeals. His vast correspondence with French Protestants shows not only much zeal, but infinite pains and considerable tact in driving home the lessons of his printed works. He spent the rest of his life reforming the church and working toward Reformation. Calvin grew ill with fever in late 1558. He feared he would soon die. Okay, that wouldn't be the case, but he feared he was going to die, and so he began to work relentlessly. I mean, by some estimates, he was working 18 to 20 hours a day, just trying to complete what he felt like was his life's work. And so in the last few years of his life, he literally worked himself to death. He was already ill, but he just kept going and going and going. And preachers understand this. We really do. I mean, I don't read that and say, oh, what is he doing? I fully understand what he was doing. He expanded his institutes from 21 chapters to 80 chapters in the last few weeks, or last few years of his life. But on February 6th, 1564, he preached a sermon, and in the sermon he had a violent fit of coughing, and in that fit of coughing he burst a blood vessel in his lung. And that was what eventually would kill him. He died on the 27th of May, 1564, at the age of 54. That's a pretty common age. I mean, at that point, that was right in line with what people, how people lived. His followers wanted to put his body in state, to lie him in state, so that everybody around Europe could come and view the body. But he had, in his will, expressly forbidden that from happening. He didn't want to become a saint. He didn't want anybody to revere him or venerate him like the Catholic Church had done with men before. He wanted his Reformed Church to be different. And so he requested that a few men bury him in an anonymous location and never reveal where that was. So he was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave, and to this day we do not know the location of it. There's a traditional grave in Geneva for him, but we do not know. There's nothing there. There's no body there. We don't know where he was born. I think that is a testimony to who he was. That he wasn't looking to become a powerhouse political figure. He was looking to reform the church and provide that. Okay. Oh, there was a picture of a woodcut there of his death. He looks like he's 80 years old, but he's only 54. But if you lived in 1540, that's probably what it felt like. 54 probably felt like 102. But this was the last moment of his life. Made a significant impact on Christianity. Let's go to our Bibles. I got plenty of time today. Just for a moment, I want to go back to the story of an earlier Reformation, the first Reformation that we see in Scripture, the people of Judah in the book of 2 Kings. So go with me to 2 Kings chapter 23. Let's walk through the story where we've been so far. We know there was a king who came to the throne at age 8. Who was he?
Josiah.
Josiah came to the throne. The first thing he did was he restored the temple. It had fallen into disrepair, and he began to restore the temple. What did he find as he went through the restoration of the temple?
Book of the Law.
The Book of the Law. He found the scrolls of Moses the prophet. And as he found them, he realized, we haven't been obeying any of this, and he repented of his own personal sin, and he led his people to Reformation. Last week we talked about how he gathered all the people of Judah together, and they all consecrated themselves before the Lord. They all promised and pledged, we will fulfill the words of this covenant. Now, God is going to bring judgment on them through Nebuchadnezzar and some of them, but what is not, I don't know how to phrase that in a question. It's not going to happen in Josiah's lifetime. God had promised him, it'll happen to your ancestors. Not a great promise, but better than it happening during yours, I guess. But now I want to read. So he's done all this. The process of Reformation has been started, but now Josiah is not just going to leave it there. And maybe we would. Maybe we would say, okay, I've done my part. I've brought the word to the people. We've seen Reformation, but now he's actually going to put his money where his mouth is. He's actually going to start to do something. We're going to read a big section. I've got time, so I'm going to read a bigger section. Because I want you to see how he handles the next steps here. I'm going to start in verse 4, chapter 23, verse 4. It says, Then the king commanded the high priest Hilkiah and the priests of the second rank and the doorkeepers to bring out of the Lord's sanctuary all the articles made for Baal, for Asherah, and all the stars in the sky. These were in the temple. You understand that? They were in the temple. There were idols and different things put in the temple itself to worship these other gods. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. And he did away with the idolatrous priests the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense at the high places in the cities of Judah and in the areas surrounding Jerusalem. They had burned incense to Baal and to the sun, moon, constellations, and all the stars in the sky. He brought out the Asherah pole from the Lord's temple to the Kidron Valley outside of Jerusalem, and he burned it at the Kidron Valley. Listen to what he does. He didn't just burn it. What does he do? He beat it to dust, and he threw its dust on the graves of the common people. He also tore down the houses of the male cult prostitutes that were in the Lord's temple. In the Lord's temple.
Disgusting.
Keep going. In which the women were weaving tapestries for Asherah. Asherah was the goddess of fertility, and so it was, when he talks about the pole and the tapestry, very graphic and very sexual in nature. So he's destroying all that. In verse 8, Josiah brought out all the priests from the cities of Judah, and he defiled the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He tore down the high places of the city gates at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, on the left of the city gate. Interesting little detail there. The priests of the high places, however, did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem. Instead, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. He defiled Topheth, which is in the Ben-Hinnom Valley, so that no one could sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Moloch. You see how wicked the society had become? And we say that though, but I mean, we could have said exactly this is happening in America today, just with different names. He did away with the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They had been at the entrance of the Lord's temple in the precincts by the chamber of Nathan Melech the eunuch. He also burned the chariots of the sun. The king tore down the altars that the kings of Judah had made on the roof of Ahaz's upper chamber. He also tore down the altars that Manasseh had made in the two courtyards of the Lord's temple, and he smashed them there and threw their dust into the Kidron Valley. The king also defiled the high places that were across from Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Destruction, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abhorrent idol of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abhorrent idol of Moab, and for Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. He broke down the sacred pillars into pieces. He cut down the Asherah poles. He filled their places with human bones. He even tore down the altar at Bethel and the high place that had been made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which caused Israel to sin. He burned the high place. He crushed it to dust. He burned the Asherah. And as Josiah turned, he saw the tombs there on the mountain. He sent someone to take the bones out of the tombs, and he burned them on the altar. He defiled it according to the word of the Lord, proclaimed by the man of God who proclaimed these things. Then he said, "What is this monument that I see?" He's not done yet. I see something else. What else is there? The men of the city told him, "It's the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things that you have done at the altar of Bethel. So he said, let him rest. Don't let anyone disturb his bones. So they left his bones undisturbed with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. And Josiah also removed all the shrines of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made to anger the Lord. Josiah did the same things to them that he had done at Bethel. He slaughtered on the altars all the priests of those high places, and he burned human bones on the altars. Then he returned to Jerusalem. All right. Talk to me about this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this passage. I've never preached through it before, so
Straight up Old Testament.
yeah, that's straight up Old Testament. That's a good way to look at it. What else?
We went all the way, but there was no,
Nothing
maybe we
left.
do this, but we don't do that, or maybe we
Yeah.
do. There was no, it was either we're going to take rid of it all,
Hmm.
or, you know what I mean?
That's
I mean,
good.
if we smash it down to dust, that's commitment right there.
That is commitment.
Some background to it, back in 1 Kings 13, he had been predicted by name that he was going to do
That he
this.
was going to do it. Yep. He put his hand to the plow and he worked. I think that's the difference between men who have great ideas and men who have great leadership. I mean, at this point, from here on out, nobody will ever look at Josiah and say he didn't do what he promised, or he didn't do enough. I mean, he went all the way. He had led spiritual reformation, but now he was accomplishing physical reformation of his town. I wrote down this. I see this quite a bit when I read in Scripture. But look at all the verbs. I tend to they kind of come out of the text at me. But here's some of the verbs that I wrote down just from this passage: commanded, burned, carried, did away with, brought, threw, tore down, defiled, smashed, broke, cut down, crushed, removed, and slaughtered. I mean, this is a paragraph, or a few paragraphs of action. This is him doing something beyond this. He relentlessly worked to purify his people. There was nothing left. There was nothing left of these altars. There was nothing left of these idols that had defiled his people. And I think we see the same spirit 2,000 years later in John Calvin. He was a man that looked and said, I'm not content with just writing a few books. He could have stopped there. This is the greatest contribution. This is his masterpiece, the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He could have stopped there, and that would have been enough for us in history to look back on a man like him. But instead, he said, I'm going all the way, and I'm going to reform the church, and I'm going to bring a pattern of reformation all across Europe. And again, we've said this week by week. I believe reformation is still possible today. If we want reformation today, though, looking all the way back through 2 Kings 22 and 23, we need leaders who care about the condition of God's house. We need people who care about the church. We need a renewed focus on God's word. We need a concern for future generations of God's people. And now, today, I want to add this to the list. We need servants willing to do the hard work. This can't be a reformation of thoughts and ideas. This has got to be a reformation of getting your hands dirty and actually doing the job. And so I love the story. I love John Calvin. I love his contribution. Not everything was perfect. There were some dark parts of his life, but I think he exemplified the spirit of what we see here in 2 Kings 23, the spirit of Josiah. We're 15 minutes early. I'm still 45 minutes long, but we're 15 minutes early. So I'm gonna end while I'm ahead, and we're gonna go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we love you and we thank you. You're so good to us. Every breath we take, every beat of our hearts, it's a gift from you, and we love you and we thank you and we praise you for it. You are holy and just, and we know that, Lord, your people have such an evil tendency to stray away from you. And we have this tendency to want our own desires and to transform the worship in your church to what we want. And I pray, Lord, that viewing what we have in the series on the Reformation and viewing the Reformation of Judah in 2 Kings 22 and 23, I pray that you'd give us hearts of these reformers. I pray that you'd give us passion and desire to see the church become the pure bride that you are looking for. I thank you for a church that values this and looks at what this means for us today. I thank you for everyone here, and I pray blessings for their faithfulness, Lord. I'm so grateful for what you do in our lives. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to open your word with God's people. And I pray, Lord, just with a heart of gratitude, thanking you and praising you for who you are and what you've done for us. I pray that you would continue to bless us this week. Lord, draw us closer to you, give us wisdom and guide us as we seek to please your heart and walk in fellowship with your Son. Father, we thank you and we love you in your name. Amen.
Amen.